It was April 1st, 1987, April Fool's Day of all days. A morning that started like any other along a stretch of rural highway in Douglas County, Colorado. The kind of road where you don't really look at the shoulder because there's never anything there. Just scrub brush, fence posts, the Rocky Mountains sitting quiet in the distance. A passing motorist was driving south along South Perry Park Road, not far from the small community of Sedalia, when something caught their eye, something down the embankment, something that didn't belong. They stopped, and what they found changed everything. Though nobody knew it yet, nobody knew that it would take nearly 4 decades, a technology that didn't fully exist in 1987, and 2 ordinary paper bags to finally tell the truth about what happened to Rhonda Marie Fisher. Rhonda was 30 years old. She had been born in New York in 1956, and somewhere along the way, life had brought her to Colorado. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was someone people loved, and someone who, in the weeks before her death, had been drifting a little, staying with different acquaintances around the Denver area, moving from place to place the way people sometimes do when things get complicated. The night before her body was found, she had been seen walking north on Monaco Street toward Leetsdale Drive in Denver, about 25 miles from where she would be discovered the next morning. 25 miles. Somewhere between that sidewalk in Denver and that embankment in Douglas County, Rhonda Marie Fisher met the last person she would ever meet. And for 38 years, nobody knew who that person was. When Douglas County investigators arrived at the scene that April morning, they did what investigators do. They documented, they photographed, they worked the scene carefully, methodically, the way good detectives are trained to do. The coroner's examination determined that Rhonda had been sexually assaulted and strangled. It was a violent death, a terrible one, and it left behind the kind of evidence that investigators hoped in 1987 might be enough to find a killer. There were leads to follow. People who knew Rhonda were interviewed. One acquaintance she had been staying with in the weeks before her death became a person of interest early in the case. Detectives looked hard at that individual, but they couldn't make it stick. And then there were the other names on the list, serial offenders who were active in the Denver metro area throughout the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s. The kind of men investigators always kept in the back of their minds when a woman turned up dead along a Colorado roadside. One of those names was Vincent Darrell Groves. More on him in a moment, because what happens next is important. At the scene that morning in 1987, investigators made a decision, one that may have seemed routine at the time, but would turn out to be one of the most consequential decisions in this entire case. When they processed Rhonda's body, they placed paper bags over each of her hands. Paper bags, the kind you might pack a lunch in. This was done to preserve trace evidence for the coroner. Any skin cells, fibers, or biological material that might be clinging to her hands or fingernails. It wasn't a new idea. Investigators had been doing versions of this for years. But in 1987, nobody was thinking about DNA. Nobody was thinking about touch DNA recovered from the inside of a paper bag nearly 4 decades later. They weren't preserving evidence for themselves. They were preserving it for people who hadn't been born yet. Those bags were collected, labeled, and stored. And then, as often happens in cases that go unsolved, time moved forward without them. The case didn't close. Cases like this rarely do, at least not officially, but it went cold. The leads dried up. The person of interest was eventually cleared. The other names on the list, the serial offenders, the men who moved through Denver's shadow world during those years, none of them could be definitely tied to Rhonda's death with the evidence available. Years passed. In 2017, investigators took another look. DNA technology had advanced significantly by then, and cold case units across the country were re-examining old evidence with new eyes. Douglas County submitted materials for DNA testing, but they couldn't get a complete profile. The results were inconclusive. The case stayed cold. The evidence was there. It had always been there, but science wasn't ready for it yet. More years passed. The world changed. DNA technology kept advancing, becoming more sensitive, more precise, more capable of pulling usable information from the most unlikely sources. And in early 2025, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit decided to try again. Before we talk about what happened in 2025, you need to understand who Vincent Darrell Groves was. Because his story is, in its own terrible way, just as important as Rhonda Fisher's. Vincent Groves was born on April 19, 1954, in Denver, Colorado. He grew up in Wheat Ridge, a western suburb of Denver. Solidly middle class, not the kind of place you'd expect to produce what authorities would call one of Colorado's most prolific serial killers. His father worked as a postal carrier and later in the military. His mother was a music teacher. They were, by all accounts, law-abiding people who raised their children with care. Vincent was tall, 6 feet 5 inches, with an athlete's build. In high school, he was a star. He played basketball for Wheat Ridge High School, and in '72, his team reached the state championship finals. He was the standout player, popular, recognized, the kind of young man people expected things from. After graduation, he went to Cole College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on the strength of his basketball. But college didn't hold him. He lost interest, stopped going to class. By 1974, he had dropped out and returned to Denver. The basketball star came home, and something, nobody could say exactly what, began to unravel. Back in Denver, Groves found work as an electrician at the Gates Rubber Company. He moved in with his grandmother, and in his free time, he began spending more and more time in Denver's red light district, around Colfax Avenue, around the kind of men and women who operated in the city's underground economy. Pimps, sex workers, drug dealers. He drank heavily. He began distributing drugs. He immersed himself in a world that was, by nature, dangerous and transactional. A world where vulnerable people could be exploited and where violence could be made to disappear into the noise of the streets. And then, in the late 70s, women started dying. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately screams serial killer. Denver is a big city. Women, particularly women in vulnerable situations, go missing and turn up dead with tragic regularity. Each case gets worked individually. The connections take time to see. But the connections were there. In 1979 alone, 3 women were strangled in Denver. Emma Jennifer, 25 years old, Joyce Ramey, 23, Peggy Cuff, 20, all strangled, all found in or near Denver. Their murders were unsolved. Groves was suspected, but suspicion isn't evidence. In 1982, investigators finally caught a break, not through the cold cases, but through a new one. Groves was convicted of second-degree murder for the 1981 killing of 17-year-old Tammy Sue Woodrum. He was sentenced to 12 years. He served 5. 5 years for a murder, then opened the gates and let him walk out. Under Colorado's mandatory parole laws at the time, his release wasn't discretionary. The system required it. In 1987, Vincent Darrell Groves, convicted murderer, suspected of at least 3 additional killings, was a free man. Prosecutors would later say that under modern risk assessment standards, a man with his history would never have been released. But this was 1987, and the laws were what they were. Groves went back to Denver. He went back to his world. And in April of 1987, Rhonda Marie Fisher was walking north on Monaco Street. Investigators who later studied Groves described him as intelligent and methodical. He had a way of making himself seem trustworthy. The kind of big, friendly-seeming man who could offer a woman a ride without immediately raising alarms. He worked at various points as a janitor supervisor overseeing cleaning crews at multiple office buildings across the Denver area. That job gave him something valuable: mobility. He traveled the city constantly, knew it intimately, and had a legitimate reason to be almost anywhere at almost any time. He cleaned buildings for a living, which is one way to think about it. Detectives who worked his case believed Groves specifically targeted vulnerable women. Women in difficult circumstances, women who might accept a ride, women who might be less likely to immediately be reported as missing, women whose disappearances might not at first connect to anything. He went to church regularly. His prison records listed his religion. His family, the family that raised him in that quiet Wheat Ridge neighborhood, reportedly didn't believe he had done these things even after conviction. That is the nature of monsters sometimes. They don't look like what we expect. The Denver District Attorney's Office would later estimate that at the height of his killing, Groves may have been murdering as many as 2 women per month. Police were finding bodies, 1 a month, for nearly a year, as investigators scrambled to build a task force to catch whoever was responsible. That task force eventually brought Groves down. In September of 1988, he was arrested near South Colorado Boulevard in Denver. He was charged and ultimately convicted in 1990 of the first-degree murder of 19-year-old Juanita Lovato and the second-degree murder of 25-year-old Diane Montoya Mancera. Both women had been strangled. Both had been found along Colorado roadsides. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. And from behind bars, investigators could continue building the case around him, connecting him over the years to more and more victims. By 2012, DNA profiling had confirmed his involvement in the 1979 murders of Emma Jennifer, Joyce Ramey, and Peggy Cuff, the 3 women whose cases had gone cold back when Groves was first suspected. Authorities believed he may have been responsible for 20 or more murders in total. Nobody will ever know the full number, because on October 31st, 1996, Halloween, Vincent Darrell Groves died in a Colorado prison. He was 42 years old. He died of complications from liver failure and hepatitis C. As he was dying, detectives came to him and asked him to give them something, to name his victims, to give families the answers they deserved. He refused. He took his secrets with him, or so he thought, back to 2025. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, a team of just 3 people, had reopened Rhonda Fisher's case. They undertook a comprehensive review of everything, every piece of evidence, every item in storage, every photograph, every interview, every material that had been collected on that April morning in 1987. They worked with forensic scientists from the Unified Metropolitan Forensic Crime Lab and staff from the Property and Evidence Facility, and they began resubmitting items for DNA testing, items that had never been tested or that had been tested years earlier with technology that wasn't sensitive enough, including those paper bags. The bags that had been placed over Rhonda's hands at the scene, the bags that had been sitting in evidence storage for 38 years. The forensic scientist who examined them later explained what had happened inside those bags over all those decades. Whatever skin cells were present on Rhonda's hands, her own and potentially anyone else's, had transferred to the interior surface of the paper. Paper, it turns out, is actually a reasonable medium for long-term preservation of biological material under the right conditions. The bags had done their job quietly for nearly 4 decades. The lab was able to extract a viable DNA profile from paper bags, grocery bags essentially, the kind of thing you throw away without thinking, sitting in a storage facility in Douglas County, Colorado, holding a secret for 38 years. The sheriff himself would later call it exceptionally rare, not just the survival of the DNA, but the ability to extract a usable profile from material that old. That profile was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI. The system that runs profiles against millions of samples collected from crime scenes, convicted offenders, and cold cases across the country. And in late October 2025, investigators received a result. Not a hit against a living person, not a profile from the convicted offender database, a case-to-case match. The DNA recovered from the paper bags on Rhonda Fisher's hands matched biological evidence from 3 homicides committed in Denver in 1979. 3 homicides attributed to Vincent Darrell Groves, the man who had been dead for nearly 30 years. For investigators who had worked cold cases, the result carried both the weight of vindication and the particular sting that comes when justice arrives too late for a courtroom. Groves had, in fact, been considered a possible suspect in Rhonda's case for years. His name was on the list, but there had been another potential suspect, another person of interest whose name kept surfacing. And without DNA confirmation, investigators couldn't be certain. Now they were certain. The DNA from those 38-year-old paper bags told them what 38 years of investigation had not been able to confirm. Vincent Groves had encountered Rhonda Marie Fisher on or around the night of March 31st, 1987. He had sexually assaulted her, he had strangled her, and he had left her body down that embankment off South Perry Park Road, where a stranger would find her the next morning on April Fool's Day. How he encountered her is not known. Investigators believe he may have offered her a ride. She was walking on a Denver street late at night, possibly looking for transportation. Groves had a documented pattern of preying on women in exactly those circumstances. Vulnerable women, women who needed something. There is no indication they knew each other. She got into a car with a man she didn't know, and she didn't survive it. He was supposed to be in prison. He would have been in prison if not for a law that said the door had to open. And when it opened, Rhonda Fisher paid the price. On December 2nd, 2025, Douglas County Sheriff Darren Weekly stood before cameras and microphones and made the announcement. The case of Rhonda Marie Fisher, open for 38 years, was officially closed. While Vincent Groves cannot be held accountable in a court of law, the sheriff said, we hope this long-awaited resolution brings answers and a measure of peace to Rhonda Fisher's family and friends. Rhonda's parents had passed away before the case was solved. Her brother had passed away. The immediate family who had waited all those years for an answer, they were gone too before the answer came. But investigators reached a cousin, a woman who was very happy, she said, to finally have answers. 38 years, that's how long some families wait. And sometimes the answer comes just a little too late for the people who needed it most. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office had solved 7 cold cases in 7 years. Rhonda Fisher's was the 7th. The cold case unit that cracked it, just 3 people working through old boxes, old bags, old evidence, applying new science to old heartbreak. And somewhere in a forensic lab, a scientist had looked at the inside of a paper grocery bag and found the name of a killer. There is something to sit with in this story. In 1987, the investigators who placed those bags over Rhonda Fisher's hands were not thinking about touch DNA. The science didn't exist. They were doing what they had been trained to do: preserve trace evidence, protect the scene, give the coroner the best possible conditions to do his work. They couldn't have known that those bags would outlast them. Couldn't have known that decades later a forensic scientist would open a box in a property room and find, still intact, still readable, the genetic fingerprint of a killer. Vincent Groves refused to confess, refused to name his victims, refused to give families anything as he died in that prison in 1996. But the science he never anticipated caught him anyway. He thought he could keep his secrets. He thought 30 years of silence was enough. He was wrong. The paper bags remembered. Story 2. Alyssa Burkett, 24 years old, pulled into the parking lot of the Green Tree Apartments in Carrollton, Texas, north of Dallas, where she worked as an assistant property manager. It was just before 9 o'clock, an ordinary morning, the kind of morning she had navigated dozens of times. A black Ford Expedition SUV was parked in the space next to where she usually parked. The driver got out as she arrived. He was dressed in dark clothing. He had a gun. He fired through her car window. The blast hit Alyssa in the head and destroyed her left eye. By any measure, it should have been fatal immediately. But Alyssa Burkett was not finished. She got out of her car, staggering, bleeding. She moved toward the apartment office door, toward her co-workers, toward help. The shooter, realizing she was still alive, ran after her. This time he had a knife, a large hunting knife. A maintenance supervisor 15 feet away heard the shot and turned around. He saw the black SUV beginning to back out of the parking space. What came next happened in seconds. Alyssa Burkett was stabbed and slashed 44 times. Her co-workers, fearing an active shooter situation, stayed inside. By the time they came out to help her, it was too late. Fire department personnel arrived. They worked on her right there on the pavement. She was gone. Detective Jeremy Chevalier, with more than 30 years in law enforcement, would later call it the most brutal scene he had ever witnessed in his career. The volume of violence, he said, told you something about the killer. It was personal. It was rage. It was someone who didn't just want Alyssa Burkett dead. He wanted her destroyed. She had been afraid for months. She had been afraid. She had told her friends what she thought was coming. She had even said his name, and still nobody could stop it. She was 24 years old, and she was figuring it out. Alyssa Burkett had grown up in Texas, and by 2019, she was back in college, working hard, building something for herself. She was young and funny and fierce, and by all accounts, an extraordinary mother from the moment her daughter entered her life. In July 2019, Alyssa gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Willow. The father was Andrew Beard. He was 9 years older, financially established, owned his own home, even had a small plane. He and Alyssa had met on a dating app. Their relationship was never serious, more of a brief connection. And then she found out she was pregnant. She was scared at first, then she fell in love with the idea of a daughter, and when Willow arrived, she fell completely. Motherhood looked great on her, said her friend and roommate Shelby. You could just tell the relationship was everything. Andrew Beard felt differently about the arrangement. Almost immediately, he began pushing for full custody of Willow. The custody battle started before Willow could even walk, with Beard dragging Alyssa in and out of court hearings, draining her financially. He made more money, he had a house, he had stability that Alyssa, still getting on her feet, was working toward. She was afraid he was going to win, that he was going to take her daughter. She was 22 when she found out she was pregnant, 24 when she died, and in between those 2 years, she fought every single day to keep her little girl. In the spring of 2020, things seemed to calm down. An agreement was reached on visitation and child support, and Beard had started dating someone new, a woman named Holly Elkins. Alyssa was relieved. She hoped Holly's presence would help smooth things between her and Andrew. Holly even texted Alyssa directly. She said she looked forward to a healthy relationship between all of them. Alyssa wrote back that she hoped so too. She had no idea who Holly Elkins really was. Holly Elkins had grown up in Michigan. She was 32 years old, and by all accounts she was someone who knew how to get what she wanted. A childhood friend described her as always the cat in every relationship. Always in the driver's seat, always in control. When Holly began dating Andrew Beard, she also began spending time with his daughter Willow. And something shifted in Holly Elkins that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. She wanted Willow, not just as a stepchild. She wanted the life, the complete family, the little girl who called her mother. The problem was Alyssa Burkett. As long as Alyssa was alive, and fighting for custody of her own daughter, Holly's version of the future was impossible. Almost immediately after Holly entered the picture, Andrew Beard became hostile with Alyssa again. He renewed demands for primary custody. Investigators would later describe what was happening behind the scenes. Text messages from Holly to Andrew that painted a picture of calculated, escalating manipulation. She called Alyssa ugly, a bad mother, worse things. Alyssa's contact name in Holly's phone was a derogatory slur, the kind of name you give someone you have decided is less than human. The harassment began in earnest. Andrew, directed, investigators say, by Holly, placed a GPS tracking device on Alyssa's car. They were monitoring her movements constantly. Alyssa couldn't understand how Andrew always seemed to know where she was and what she was doing. She just knew she was being watched. She told her friends she felt like she was always looking over her shoulder. That's how she lived every single day. Under surveillance, she couldn't see, couldn't prove. Then in September 2020, 1 month before her murder, someone called 911 using a fake name. The caller reported that a young woman was selling drugs out of her car at the Green Tree Apartments. They gave Alyssa's license plate number, the color and model of her vehicle, everything needed to make the report sound credible. The police responded. They searched Alyssa's trunk. Inside, drugs, a pistol, and cash, exactly where the caller said they would be. They had been planted there. Police quickly concluded Alyssa knew nothing about these items. The frame-up had failed. Later that day, Alyssa texted her roommate Shelby. She said she thought Andrew was going to try to get someone to kill her next. Shelby's heart dropped. She wasn't a fearful person. Shelby would later say, for her to be asking for help, she was genuinely scared. 1 month later, Alyssa Burkett was dead. Hours after the murder, police pulled over Andrew Beard's pickup truck on an alleged traffic violation. Beard was calm, unnervingly calm. He and Holly Elkins were in the truck. Willow was in a car seat in the back. They were allowed to go. Because he had court-mandated visitation rights, Beard was allowed to take Willow with them. They went to a hotel. That night, investigators searched Beard's house and found what they needed. A backpack in the living room contained an envelope with scribbled notes, Alyssa's license plate number, the color and model of her car, and the fake name that had been used to make the 911 drug tip. The entire plan, written out in Andrew Beard's own hand, and kept charging stations and batteries matching the GPS tracking device found on Alyssa's car after the murder. And inside the pickup seized at the traffic stop, bottles of very dark foundation makeup. Investigators believe Beard had used it to disguise himself on the morning of the murder. The next day, the black Ford Expedition SUV was found abandoned less than a mile from Beard's house. Security camera footage from a neighboring home showed a figure in dark clothing running away from the SUV back toward Beard's house immediately after the attack. Inside the SUV, Alyssa's blood. Also found a fake Halloween-style beard. 3 days after Alyssa's murder, Andrew Beard surrendered himself to the Carrollton Police Department. He was charged with murder. He had purchased an SUV specifically to commit the murder. He had bought a Halloween costume to disguise himself. He had kept his handwritten planning notes in a backpack in his own living room, and then he drove home and waited to see what happened next. Holly Elkins had sat down voluntarily with detectives the day after the murder. She performed, investigators would later say, extraordinarily well. She cried. She said she couldn't believe the man she loved was capable of something like this. She was, according to those who later reviewed the interview, giving the performance of her life. Then, when Beard was released on bond 2 weeks after his arrest, Holly packed her bags and left. She didn't wait for him. She ordered an Uber and went home to Michigan. She built herself a new life, a new condo, a new car, a new boyfriend, and never mentioned Alyssa Burkett's name to anyone. As part of his plea deal, Andrew Beard eventually told investigators everything. Holly Elkins, he said, was the one running the show. She had told him what to do, when to do it, and how. The drug plant had been her idea. The GPS tracker had been her idea. The disguise had been her idea. Even the dark makeup. Dress up so no one would recognize you, she had allegedly told him. A week before the murder, while Holly was away in Mexico, she had texted Beard, "I hope you handle it. I'm not coming home to BS." He had responded, "That's my goal." To which Holly wrote, "Well, it will be a whole different conversation if I feel like you are ride or die. If not, then I don't know. Ride or die. Do this or we're done." After he killed Alyssa, Andrew told investigators Holly asked him to describe the murder to her in detail. She was in Mexico when it happened. She texted him the week before. She asked for details afterward. And then she went to Miami and started over, as if none of it had ever touched her. Andrew Beard pleaded guilty in 2022. In May 2023, he was sentenced to 43 years in federal prison. Investigators believed Holly Elkins thought it was over. That the further she got from Texas, the less connected to any of it she would be. They were building a case against her the entire time. In July 2023, federal agents arrested Holly Elkins at Miami International Airport as she was turning from a trip to the Dominican Republic. She was charged with conspiracy to stalk and stalking using a dangerous weapon resulting in death. Her phone had plenty to say. Searches for tracking devices, evidence tying her to the purchase of disguise materials, text messages showing she had been directing the operation in real time. In April 2024, after a 1-week trial, the jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty. Holly Elkins was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. She wanted a perfect little family, a man, a home, a little girl who would call her mother. She had it all mapped out. The only thing standing between her and that life was a 24-year-old woman named Alyssa. Andrew Beard has not seen or had any contact with his daughter since the day he was arrested. He told investigators his biggest regret was letting Willow down. Willow, now 5 years old, lives with her grandmother Teresa, Alyssa's mother, who adopted her. Teresa says Willow walks like Alyssa, has Alyssa's spirit. Even the way she turns and walks away, Teresa sees her daughter in every step. At a graveside visit not long after the trial, Willow, who had never cried over her mother until that day, began crying and asked her grandmother if she could please bring her mom back. just one more time, just to see her. Teresa told her that Alyssa was in heaven. Willow asked if her mom had a phone number there. She was 24 years old. She was figuring it out. She was doing everything right, going back to school, building a career, fighting in court, raising a little girl who clung to her every second of every day. She was scared in those final months. She knew something was coming. She said so out loud to the people she trusted most. And she showed up to work anyway, every single day, because Willow needed her to. One day, Willow will know the whole story. Her family hopes that when that day comes, she will see her mother's love more clearly than anything else. The love that drove Alyssa Burkett to fight every single day for the life she wanted to give her daughter. Story 3. Dr. Teresa Sievers. Everyone at the medical practice knew the sound. 4-inch heels moving fast down a hallway. Click, click, click. Dr. Teresa Sievers had a walk that announced her. A short woman who filled every room she entered. A physician who moved through the world as if there were not enough hours in the day for everything she wanted to accomplish. On Monday morning, June 29, 2015, her medical assistant, Sandra Hoskins, arrived at work at 9 o'clock, and the hallway was quiet. 9, 9:05, 9:15, no heels. Sandra texted, no answer. Called, no answer. Reached out to Teresa's husband, Mark, who was out of town. He couldn't reach her either. Something was wrong. Mark Sievers asked a friend to go check on his wife at their home in Bonita Springs in southwest Florida. That friend arrived and found Teresa Sievers on her kitchen floor, dead. A hammer lay nearby. She had flown home from a family vacation the night before, rolled her suitcase through the door, and someone had been waiting. Teresa Sievers was 46 years old. She had been born in Connecticut, built a life in Florida, and created a medical practice that patients described as transformative. She had flown home from a family vacation the night before, rolled her suitcase through the door, and someone had been waiting. Teresa Sievers was 46 years old. She had been born in Connecticut, built a life in Florida, and created a medical practice that patients described as transformative. A holistic approach that blended traditional medicine with alternative healing. Patients came from around the world. Some of them said she had saved their lives. The medical examiner would determine she had been struck 17 times in the head with a hammer. Who would want this woman dead, and why with such fury? The answer would take investigators more than 1,000 miles away from Florida, and into one of the strangest cases of obsession and betrayal in recent American crime history. Within days of Teresa's murder, investigators had spoken to nearly everyone in her life: colleagues, patients, family, friends, and her husband, Mark Sievers. Mark was cooperative from the start. He handed over his cell phone voluntarily. He sat down with detectives without a lawyer. He answered every question. He also had an alibi that was essentially unassailable. At the time of his wife's murder, Mark Sievers was hundreds of miles away in upstate New York with Teresa's family and their 2 young daughters. He couldn't have done this, not physically. He was eliminated as a direct suspect almost immediately. But investigators downloaded his cell phone anyway, and what they found suggested the Sievers' marriage was more complicated than anyone had known. Serious financial problems, despite outward appearances, and 5 life insurance policies on Teresa Sievers totaling more than $4 million. $4 million with an airtight alibi, which, if you think about it, is the ideal combination for someone who doesn't want to do the actual work himself. Meanwhile, in August 2015, acting on a tip, police made 2 arrests, not in Florida, but in Missouri, more than 1,000 miles away. The first suspect, a man named Jimmy Ray Rogers. Nobody had heard of him. The second suspect, a man named Curtis Wayne Wright. And that name, that face in the mugshot, stopped people cold. Because Curtis Wayne Wright looked almost exactly like Mark Sievers. Curtis Wayne Wright, who went by Wayne, had grown up in Hillsboro, Missouri. He and Mark Sievers had known each other since childhood. They were, by all accounts, best friends. Wayne was at Teresa's wedding. He celebrated with them. Just 2 months before her murder, Mark had been Wayne's best man. Wayne traveled from Missouri to Florida regularly to work on the computers in Dr. Sievers' medical office. Staff described him as a geek, focused, a little odd maybe. He and Mark called each other brothers. But there was something else about Wayne Wright that people had begun to notice over the years. He had started to look more and more like Mark Sievers. As Mark began going bald, Wayne shaved his own head. Their faces, their builds, in photographs, people sometimes had trouble telling them apart. He didn't just want to be close to Mark's life, he wanted to be mistaken for him. Whether that was by chance or by design, nobody could quite say. In 1996, Wayne's name had surfaced in a disturbing context. A preacher named Ronnie Bolin, the brother of Wayne's childhood friend Greg, had mysteriously disappeared. His car was found with the keys still in the ignition at a car wash in St. Louis. He was never found. Wayne was listed as a person of interest. He was never charged. The question of what Wayne Wright was capable of had been sitting unanswered for nearly 2 decades. Now it had an answer. The investigation turned on a rental car GPS system. On the morning of June 27, 2015, Wayne Wright picked up a rental car in Hillsboro, Missouri, and went to get Jimmy Rogers. The 2 men then punched a destination into the GPS, Bonita Springs, Florida, 1,100 miles away. They drove through the night. The GPS tracked every mile. They arrived at the Sievers home at approximately 6 in the morning on June 28th. They entered the property and disabled the security alarm, which may explain why Mark's mother had been confused about the alarm system the night before and then left. They drove to a nearby Walmart. Surveillance cameras caught them clearly. Neither man made any effort to disguise himself. They walked through the store and purchased trash bags, wet wipes, black towels, black shoes, and a lock-picking kit. They paid cash. Then, according to investigators, they drove to the beach, soaked up some Florida sun, and then returned to the Sievers home, where they waited. They went to the beach. A woman was going to come home and die, and they went to the beach. There's a particular kind of cold in that detail that stays with you. Teresa Sievers had flown home alone from New York that Sunday night, leaving Mark and the girls to follow later. She was supposed to see patients Monday morning. She rolled her suitcase through the door of her own home and into the dark kitchen. Wayne Wright later testified that when Teresa walked in, he hit her with a hammer, and said he thought in those first confused, violent seconds that she thought he was Mark, because Wayne Wright looked like Mark. Jimmy Rogers joined in the attack. The two men struck Teresa Sievers 17 times. Afterward, they drove the 17 hours back to Missouri. Their digital footprint stretched every mile of the way. When investigators brought in Jimmy Rogers' pregnant girlfriend, Taylor Shellmaker, she told them that Jimmy had confided to her. He had asked her to throw pieces of his smashed cell phone, some gloves, and a jumpsuit out of the car window along a rural Missouri road. And he had told her what happened in Florida. He had told her about the hammer. The fiber from the jumpsuit Rogers had been wearing was later found on Teresa Sievers' body. Wayne Wright, facing the possibility of the death penalty, made a decision. He took a deal, 25 years in exchange for his testimony against both Rogers and Mark Sievers. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and then he began to talk. Wayne Wright told prosecutors that the murder had been Mark Sievers' idea from the beginning, that Mark believed Teresa was planning to leave him and take their daughters, that the couple had serious money problems beneath the surface of their comfortable life, that Mark had told Wayne the only solution, the only way out, was for Teresa to die, and that the money from those insurance policies would make everything right. His best friend, his brother from another mother, the man whose wedding he had stood in just 2 months before, Wayne Wright says Mark Sievers looked him in the eye and asked him to kill his wife. Mark Sievers denied it. He had denied it from the beginning and never stopped. Jimmy Rogers went to trial first in October 2019, a fiber connecting him to the scene, his own girlfriend's testimony, and Wayne Wright sitting in the witness chair describing the attack in detail. Rogers' defense argued Wright was lying to save himself, that Rogers had nothing to do with it, that the jury should not believe a man who admitted to being there and taking a deal. The jury was out nearly 2 days. Jimmy Ray Rogers was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Mark Sievers went to trial in November 2019. His defense pointed to the absence of direct physical evidence linking him to the murder. They argued Wayne Wright, who had confessed to being one of the killers, was constructing a story to reduce his own sentence. Mark Sievers did not testify. The jury was out 4 hours. They found him guilty of first-degree murder, and they did something else. They recommended the death penalty. On January 3, 2020, a judge sentenced Mark Sievers to death. He currently sits on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Florida. His conviction was affirmed by the Florida Supreme Court in November 2022. He sat at her funeral with a gun on his hip, saying he was afraid for his family's safety. He gave police his phone voluntarily, thinking they couldn't possibly have enough evidence. He may have been right about that for a while. Wayne Wright is serving 25 years. Jimmy Rogers is serving life. Mark Sievers awaits execution. Teresa Sievers' daughters, the girl she had left behind in New York to fly home early to get back to her patients, to be the doctor and the mother and the person she had always been, are growing up without her. She came home to run her own house. She walked through her own door, and someone she trusted had sent 2 men to meet her there. She was born in Connecticut in 1968. She built her life in Florida. She healed people who had been told they couldn't be healed. She was 46 years old and at the peak of everything she had worked for. She flew home early from a family vacation because her patients needed her Monday morning. That was the kind of doctor she was, the kind of person she was. She rolled her suitcase through her own front door for the last time. Story 4. Raymond Wright. Some absences announce themselves quietly. A missed call, an unanswered text, a door that doesn't open when you knock. Small silences that stack on top of each other until they become something you can no longer explain away. Dean Wright knew his brother Raymond's voice the way you know the sound of your own heartbeat. Something constant, something you stop noticing because it's simply always there. Every single day of their adult lives, the two brothers had spoken. Phone calls, texts, just checking in. The rhythm of it was as reliable as the sunrise. And then, in January of 2018, it stopped. It was Saturday morning, January 13th, in Sacramento, California. Dean hadn't heard from his younger brother in 2 days. 2 full days of nothing. No calls, no texts, no posts, no voicemails, just silence. Raymond Wright was 55 years old, a master carpenter, a man described by everyone who knew him as generous, creative, and vibrant, a father, a grandfather, a man who had spent years rebuilding his life after some hard chapters, and who by January of 2018 had rebuilt it beautifully. He was at the best point of his life, which makes what happened next all the more difficult to sit with. Dean drove to Ray's house in Rockland, a Sacramento suburb. He checked the shop Ray rented in Rio Linda for his carpentry work. Nothing seemed out of place, but Ray's truck was gone, and Ray was nowhere. By Saturday afternoon, more than 48 hours had passed since anyone had seen or heard from Raymond Wright. His daughters, Haley and Kennedy, were beginning to understand that this was not a misunderstanding. I called and I called and I called, Haley would later say, straight to voicemail every time. His wife, Peggy, the woman Ray married in 1994, the woman who called him the love of her life even after their divorce, knew immediately something was wrong. When Ray went out of touch, there was a reason, and the reasons were never good. The Wright family organized a search. Flyers at a Target parking lot, social media posts, spreading out in every direction. The resounding question echoing at all hours. Where was Ray? To understand what happened to Raymond Wright, you first have to understand who he was. Ray was a man who had known both the best and worst of himself. He had been a loving husband and an instant father to Haley, his stepdaughter, when she was just 3 years old. He was the kind of dad who coached t-ball, took his kids fishing, showed up to every swim meet, did everything to the fullest. But Ray had also struggled. He was a recovering alcoholic who had stayed sober for nearly 20 years. Then his second marriage fell apart in 2009, and somewhere in that pain, he relapsed. The relapse led somewhere darker. In November 2011, Ray got behind the wheel drunk and slammed head-on into another vehicle. The couple inside were seriously hurt. The wife nearly died. The husband suffered broken bones that left him with a permanent limp and pain that never fully went away. Ray was convicted of felony DUI. He served jail time. He was ordered to pay more than $275,000 in restitution to the couple he had hurt. And then Ray Wright did what people who have truly hit bottom sometimes do. He stopped. He rejoined Alcoholics Anonymous. He checked in with his sponsor every single day. He became, by all accounts, a better version of himself than he had ever been before. He hurt people, he knew it, and he spent years trying to make it right. The question the jury would eventually ask was whether that was enough for everyone. By the holidays of 2017, Ray was thriving. He spent Thanksgiving and Christmas with his family. He built a custom crib for his first granddaughter, Ashton. He was a proud grandfather, a man at peace. Weeks later, he was gone. Dean Wright returned to his brother's house on January 13th. He let himself in, said hello into the quiet, and immediately smelled marijuana smoke. Ray didn't smoke marijuana, had no interest in it. Dean knew this. Something was wrong. He moved through the house and saw it. A cup on the kitchen counter, a gas station soda cup, full of ice, full of soda, sweating with condensation, fresh. It hadn't been there before. He took another step, and that's when a back door burst open and a man yelled at him to get out. Dean demanded to know who the man was. Where was Ray? The intruder took a step toward him, then turned and ran out the back door. Dean called 911. When Rockland police arrived, Dean filed a missing persons report and pointed to that soda cup. Sacramento County Prosecutor Matt Chisholm would later describe it simply, it had a lid, a straw, and it was sweating. It was fresh. Someone had been in that house very recently. A soda cup, the kind you buy at a gas station and throw away without thinking. The kind that leaves behind a straw, and a straw leaves behind something else entirely. Police collected the cup as evidence, including the straw. As days turned into weeks, investigators checked Ray's bank accounts. No activity. His phone wasn't working. His truck had disappeared from license plate readers. All signs pointed to something far more serious than a man who had quietly decided to disappear. 10 days after his disappearance, police found Ray's white Ford pickup abandoned in a North Highlands apartment complex in a high crime area. The radio had been stripped, the license plates were gone, and the back of the truck, barely visible on the dark carpet liner, were brown stains that would later be confirmed as human blood. Ray Wright's blood. His daughter Haley said seeing the truck was the moment she knew something had happened to him. 16 days after Ray Wright vanished, something happened that cracked the case wide open, though nobody knew it yet. A California Highway Patrol officer noticed a white van with expired registration, but with current registration sticker tabs on the license plate. Someone had peeled stickers off a registered vehicle and stuck them on this one. The officer tried to pull the van over. The van ran. What followed was a high-speed chase through Sacramento, reaching speeds of 100 miles an hour. It ended badly. The van slammed into another vehicle. The driver, pinned inside with a broken leg, was pulled out by officers. His name was Victor Gray. He had a history with law enforcement. He was arrested for felony evasion and DUI. But here's where it gets interesting. When police ran the registration stickers through DMV records, they discovered those tabs belonged to a 2016 Ford pickup, one recently reported missing along with its owner, Raymond Wright. Victor Ray had been driving around Sacramento with Ray Wright's registration sticker on his van. Either the most arrogant criminal in California or the most oblivious. Perhaps both. Victor Gray was now linked to Ray Wright's disappearance. But how and why? The answer to the question was still months away, but the first part came quickly. In April 2018, investigators got a DNA hit on the soda straw from the cup left behind in Ray's house, the straw that the fleeing intruder had been drinking from. The DNA matched Victor Gray. He had been inside Ray Wright's house. He had been the intruder Dean had encountered, and he had left behind, without realizing it, a perfect biological signature of his presence. 2 pieces of evidence, 1 name. When investigators processed Gray's wrecked van, what they found inside changed everything. Unrolling a black plastic tarp in the van's cargo area, they discovered a collection of items that told a terrible story. Ray Wright's yellow rain jacket, one he had owned for 15 years, soaked in his blood. His wallet, his broken glasses, shattered into pieces. A cell phone that had been beaten with what appeared to be a hammer. So destroyed they had to run the serial number from the back to confirm it was Ray's. A hat with Ray Wright's own carpentry design on it, and then Gray's cell phone, which had slid under the center console during the crash and had been recovered by the FBI. Inside that phone, a treasure trove. Text messages from a woman investigators would come to call California Katie, messages sent on the morning of January 11, 2018, the day Ray disappeared. She had been watching Ray's workshop from a trailer parked next door. "Ray's out front of the shop," she texted. "Just you and him, hun," came another. A lookout. Someone had been watching Ray, feeding his location in real time to Victor Gray, who was waiting nearby. And then there was the letter, a photograph of a handwritten 3-page letter found on Gray's phone, addressed to someone named Bob, dated January 27, 2018, the very day of the high-speed chase. In it, Gray complained about not being paid. He had delivered the dude, he wrote. He had hand-delivered you your revenge, and now it was time to pay up. Hand-delivered you your revenge. 7 words that turned a missing person case into something else entirely. 7 words that pointed straight at a motive 6 years in the making. The woman called California Katie was identified as Katie Bernard. She lived in the trailer next to Ray's workshop. When investigators brought her in for questioning, she was frightened and reluctant, but she began to talk. She told them that she had thought this was only about stealing Ray's truck. She hadn't understood, she said, that she was really part of it. And she gave them a name: Bob, Bobby, Robert Manor, Katie's ex-boyfriend. Robert Manor was the man Ray Wright had hit with his car in November 2011. The man whose wife had nearly died. The man who had walked away from that accident with broken bones and a permanent limp and a pain that never left him, and apparently a rage that never cooled. Manor had been ordered to receive $275,000 in restitution. Ray had made occasional payments, but not much. Investigators learned that Manor was not a man you wanted to owe money to. He had a reputation in North Sacramento as a feared methamphetamine dealer. He had done time for assault and selling drugs while armed, and witnesses told police that Manor had spent years simmering over what Ray Wright had done to him, that he had never let it go, not for a single day. A few months before Ray disappeared, Manor happened to visit Katie at her trailer, and through the window just yards away, he saw the man he blamed for shattering his life, working in his shop like nothing had ever happened. That, investigators believe, may have been the moment the plan was set in motion. Katie told police that after Ray disappeared, she confronted Manor. She asked him directly, and Manor looked at her and told her he had taken care of it. Then he grabbed her around the neck, choked her, and told her she would never speak of it again. 3 words from multiple witnesses, all reporting the same thing Manor had said when he saw them after Ray's disappearance. I got him. I got him. 3 words said to multiple people, as if he couldn't help himself, as if after years of waiting, he simply had to tell someone. Gray's cellmate in Sacramento County Jail later came forward with what Gray had allegedly told him about Ray Wright's final hours. According to the cellmate, Gray said he had delivered Ray to Manor alive, that Ray's house had plastic sheeting laid across the floors, that Manor had Ray poisoned, and that afterward Manor had Ray's body dismembered. Ray Wright's body has never been found. In March 2021, prosecutors charged Robert Manor and Victor Gray with the kidnapping and murder of Raymond Wright. Both pleaded not guilty. The trial begun in March 2023, more than 5 years after Ray had vanished. It was what prosecutors call a no-body homicide, one of the most difficult kinds of cases to prosecute. You lose information when you lose the body. The defense had credibility to attack at every turn. Witnesses with criminal histories, a jailhouse informant, a lookout who had been granted immunity. But the evidence spoke in ways the defenders could not easily dismiss. Ray Wright's bloodied raincoat, his shattered glasses, his destroyed phone, a letter written by Gray himself demanding payment for delivering a man to his death, text messages placing both Gray and Katie Bernard at the scene on the morning of the kidnapping, jail call recordings where Gray told his wife he had cleaned up the scene, and multiple witnesses, none of whom knew each other, none of whom had coordinated, all reporting the same 3 words from Robert Manor's own mouth: I got him. After 8 days of trial, the jury deliberated for about 4 hours. Robert Manor and Victor Gray were found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ray Wright had paid his debt to society. He had done his time, completed his probation, rejoined the living. The law had said enough. But Robert Manor had a different accounting. Raymond Wright's body has never been found. His case remains technically open as a missing person with the Rockland Police Department. His daughters still have no place to lay him to rest. At sentencing, Kennedy Wright looked at the 2 men who had taken her father and said simply, "My dad will be in heaven amongst the angels where he belongs, and you'll be in prison for life where you belong." Raymond Wright, 1962 to 2018, still missing, never forgotten.